Oh, we're on.
Hi, Becky.
Hi. Hi, Becky Wasserman, Legislative Counsel. I can share now, the draft 6.1 to S94. I, as a reminder, worked on the TIF sections, and
There we go.
David worked on the veggie VEPSI section. So I've not made any changes to my parts of the bill.
I think there were two tiny changes
Okay.
to David's part of the bill.
Okay.
And they were,
I can pull up his email.
I don't know if I need to characterize them as tiny, removing the new auditor authority that got added in. And then, membership change. Shuffles. Yes.
In VEPSI.
In a study committee.
Okay.
Second study committee.
The auditor change was in the VEPSI section.
The auditor change was in the
Section
VEPSI
one.
section. Yes. So can you show us that, and then,
I believe that was sort of added at the end in the previous version. So I think the language,
the absence of language is not obvious.
yeah, so the language that is included here on executive session says that notwithstanding any provision of law to the contrary, the council shall not enter an executive session to discuss applications or other matters pertaining to the veggie program under subchapter 2 of this chapter unless the executive branch state economist is present and has been provided all relevant materials concerning the session.
What page are you on? Sorry.
So this is section 1, page 3, line 15.
And then will you scroll down to
The study committees, sorry, look away.
it's like seeing an action movie. Theater. Different.
It's not quite as.
It's a similar blinking thing. Anyway.
It's colorful.
So there was the section 11, the study committee
It's not that one, it's the second.
veggie, and then the page 20, section 12, study committee on financing public infrastructure improvements.
Yes.
So it looks like, based on David's highlighting, this is where the changes were made. So the committee membership is composed of 2 current members of the House appointed by the Speaker, 2 current members of the Senate appointed by the pro tem. And then on page 21, 1 member appointed by the Vermont Association of Planning and Development Agencies, then 1 member appointed by vote of the Regional Development Corporations, and then finally 1 member appointed by the Vermont Council on Rural Development.
Representative Maslin.
Ma'am, Bill and I talked in the cafeteria towards the end of last week whether there should be a representative from the RDC's road.
It's on,
Number 13.
Number 13,
Yeah.
line 14.
that came up, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Catherine's got you.
I felt that conversation.
Thank you.
It was channeled through you.
Good job.
Yeah, I'm on it.
Okay, I think that's all the changes.
That's good.
I see additional highlighting and without any knowledge or.
Thank you, Becky. Show us David's work.
It looks like the committee has to solicit testimony from certain stakeholders. That would include representatives from municipalities of a variety of sizes.
That was an artful.
Small, medium, and large.
Yes.
And I believe that might be the only change. Oh, no, there's more changes, page 23.
Such an adventure.
Subsection E, the meetings, the speaker and pro tem shall jointly appoint from among the legislative members of the committee a person to serve as chair. And that first meeting would occur by September 1st. And then in terms of assistance, the committee would have the administrative, fiscal, and legal assistance of the Office of Legislative Operations, JFO, and Office of Legislative Counsel.
Thanks. I have a clarifying question about the TIF stuff. Can you explain how the 2 TIFs per county works, given the changes that we're making around active districts and non-active districts?
Okay, so currently there are the list of approved districts and statute that can use education and property tax financing. So then there's a separate, that's in Title 24, and that was that list that this bill is proposing to change by striking out that list and saying that there shall be no more than 14 active districts in the state. And part of the reason for doing that is that when you have a set list in statute, it's hard to keep it updated. You have to keep changing it. So I'll just use the example of Montpelier. If Montpelier had been added to the list when they were approved and then they became inactive, then they would need to be taken off by, legislation to reflect that change. So the move to saying 14 active districts is sort of setting an amount, like a maximum amount of active districts in the state. And a district can dissolve and become inactive. It dissolves when they retire the debt after they sort of gone through the whole process of paying back their debt. And then they can vote like Montpelier did to sort of become inactive. So that is the change that's being proposed there in terms of moving from that list to that set number of active districts. Separately in Title 32, current law says that in addition to what is in that list, there can be no more than 6 additional districts approved and no more than 2 per county. And so by taking away that's current law. So by taking away the active list, you kind of have to reconcile that with setting that max number of 14.
This is where I'm getting confused. If I could just.
Yes.
So you said the district can become inactive and it becomes inactive and dissolves when the debt is retired, but then it could vote to become active again using that placeholder?
No, it cannot vote. It can.
I think you listed 2 different ways a district could become
Yes.
active. Maybe you could repeat
Yeah,
that.
so it can, and I don't know if the correct term is that it dissolves when its debt is retired, and then it can also vote to become inactive.
Or can vote.
I think
Inactive.
Manchester was an example of becoming inactive, and Montpelier.
So, okay, so it could either the debt's over or they just say, let's vote and become inactive. But
Yes,
then additionally, not greater than 6 districts can be approved, not greater than 2 per county. When I see that, it seems reasonable, except that it seems less reasonable if you look at it by county instead of by population. I mean, when you do it by county, I've been involved in things on the statewide level where, okay, let's do 1 in every county. And so you had 1 person to do work in each county, whatever it was, in education or whatever it was. I think more in, over in natural resources. And that sounds good, except if you're serving 250,000 people with 1 person versus I don't know how many people with another person in a less populous county. So then when I look at that, I just don't see the equity there.
This is current law, so this is just a policy decision the legislature made. I want to say that I can look up the exact date. I definitely drafted it, but I want to say it was around 2014. So that was when a decision was made by the legislature to say, we have this list of districts that have been approved. We want to tell VEPSI, don't approve more than 6 than what is in that list. And when you're looking at approving 6, no more than 2 can be per county. So that is current law, and that's what the legislature decided, just a policy decision. So of course you could come at that any way. You could look at it by population. You could make other policy decisions surrounding how you want to limit or expand TIF districts around the state. That is just what it currently is. And so if you are making a policy decision to change from having that list in statute and saying from that list no more than 6, and you're moving it to a cap of just 14 active, what this is doing is it's just keeping that consistent, no more than 2 per county to what is already in law. You could, of course, remove that now and just have it be no more than 14 around the state without any limit per county. But this was drafted to sort of maintain consistency with how it currently operates.
And what I imagine is that with the change to just the status of number of active districts rather than the list in statute, if a TIF is retired in whatever way, then there could be a new TIF in that county, sort of more, it would be more explicit in the law that a
Right.
TIF in that county could form if that county was already at its maximum number of TIFs.
Right, because I think the other problem with saying no more than 6 can be approved is that is set from a date and time. So that was no more than 6 from when that came into law. So some of those, so it's not that there's 6 available right now. Some of those have been some of those 6 have been used up. So this is, I think, changing to the 14 active is making it clear, like it's allowing for sort of changes over time rather than naming the districts and having to refer back to a moment in time of like how many have been approved as of this date. Are there 5 slots out of that 6 left? Are there 4? So I think it's just sort of helping keep track a little better. And so if, for example, Montpelier was an active district, now it is inactive under this new proposal, that would open up an active district that could be approved.
Okay. I'm really glad for the study because I think it's another way for us to help places that do not have infrastructure or whatever to create and manage TIFs, which I don't see us really making any easier to do. And grow their grand lists and have good development where they are. So I think it's great. I think it's great that them working together, whether they're really working together or just working side by side to achieve the same goals. That's what I want to say.
Yes.
Did we resolve the emergency TIF issue?
I have not made any changes.
Well, I still have a question on that, which is page 15, big B, lines 13 through 18. If that happens and they exceed the 14 active districts and say they go to 15, does that negate the 15 TIF limit and make it as a 14 TIF limit and make it 15 from then on?
I think it does create an inconsistency in statute that is sort of similar to what happens right now with that list in statute of these are the only districts that are approved to use education financing. property tax financing, and then there are more than that. So I think it does, by listing it, by having this in there, it creates another situation where the statute, isn't sort of being flexible to, or sorry, the situation isn't being able to be flexible to what the statute says.
I would be perfectly happy to remove that paragraph, both because I think the idea of a TIF emergency is ridiculous and because it is another place that there's sort of space for confusion.
I'm from getting rid of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, do you think there are TIF emergencies?
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
I'd like to focus on page 9 of this draft. And there's two places in here where there's language added. Line 3, I think it is, and line 17 through 20, if I have that right. To me, these both make it harder to form a TIF. And I mean, development in Vermont is really difficult to make happen in and by itself. And I think we should really consider whether we want to make it even more difficult for a community to set up a TIF. And I think these two additions of language would do that. And I think we should consider removing them from the bill as well.
It's the debt for debt, and what's the second one?
The use of bond
On
anticipation
anticipation notes.
notes.
As a first occurrence.
So I actually think the prohibition on the use of debt to pay for debt service interest payments, I think that is sort of a policy decision that in that first couple of years when, if a municipality doesn't have another way to pay for those infrastructure improvements, it could make it more difficult to do so unless there's another funding source. So that's definitely a policy decision about how to go about that. And I think that is something the legislature has looked at a few times over the last 2 years. With respect to the bond anticipation notes, my understanding with this one was that by saying it's not considered a first incurrence of debt is that it is trying to not start the clock for the time period that a municipality has to incur debt and retain increment. So I think that I don't actually know if it makes it harder for them, but I think the intent there is to not start the clock earlier than it otherwise would be started if you counted bond anticipation notes as a first incurrence of debt.
And so the idea being that a TIF does a bond anticipation note, gets to do a little bit of prep work, then gets to start their clock, so they get a longer debt incurrence period than they would if their bond anticipation note was included.
Because I think those are short term, maybe a year or two before you incur your longer term debt. So I think it actually gives them a little bit more time.
I see the hands. I just want to let Becky finish her sentences.
Yeah, so you may want to hear from VEPC or municipalities on whether that is actually creating a challenge or not.
Representative Maslin, Representative Anthony, and Representative Deborah.
Yeah, recalling the discussion from last year, previous years, it was the intention of bond anticipation notes, just, not start the clock, but get things started, just. And I must have voted for it, I guess I did, but I've never been all that keen on it. And I'm still all that not keen. I mean, I understand the purpose, I see where it comes from, where it gets us. My concern in plain English and not very articulate legislative language is that we concoct mechanisms to sort of string things out, and sometimes I'm not particularly happy with them.
Representative Anthony?
Thank you. I happen to agree with Scott in the first instance, that seems to create, again, another higher hurdle for some communities easily met by other communities. So it really discriminates against some communities. So I wouldn't weep if it were out. On the second instance of the timeline, that is standard practice for people who are municipalities who are doing, for instance, a water project, and they use short-term financing as a bridge loan, so to say, or bond anticipation note.
Right.
And by definition, the lender generally says, and by the way, this is non-renewable and it's for X, and usually not in excess of 2 years. So it almost has a automatic, by the financing terminology, end time. And it's not a way to ad infinitum, stretch out the calendar. So I think that one should stay and not allow bridge financing to be counted as the start of the clock.
Oh, sorry, no, it's
I don't-
Carl, not you.
I
Yeah.
don't disagree, even though I'm just started processing this. I know the solid waste district that I'm part of down in River Valley has used bans in order to bridge our way forward. It is a mechanism, it does work, they accomplish a purpose. This is, it's just becoming a more sophisticated statute, should we say, that's all. Explanation.
I'd never heard of a ban or a bond anticipation note before. It seems like you get a bond and note in the same, is it just a note before you get a bond that covers some costs at the beginning? What is it?
I think I've never been great at explaining these, but I think it is a way, it's a short term, my understanding is that it's less than 2 years, and it's a short term way to get funding through debt to for the startup of a project, but it's not the long term bonding that you incur for 20 or 30 years.
And is it usually,
We're gonna let it.
is it usually like up to a certain amount? I mean, does it, after what point does it stop being a note and becomes a bond? I mean, that's,
I actually don't know if there's the monetary threshold. I can get back to you on that.
That would be great. Thank you, Becky. Representative Becky.
So under current law, Becky, if a district gets a bond anticipation note, does the clock start ticking?
I think this is being proposed as a change because there was some disagreement about whether it started the clock. And I can't remember the district this happened with, and maybe it was more than one, but I think maybe this was something identified by the auditor in a report that a district had done this, and the auditor had maybe believed that. So I think it just, because it wasn't, specifically dealt with in statute, it created confusion about, when the district could start, the time period the district could incur debt. So this is meant to clarify, and you could obviously clarify in any direction, but it's sort of, there's no language on it right now, so it's meant to clarify that going forward.
Okay, so, given that, what I've just heard, I think makes some sense. I think I probably, it's not even a motion yet, but I think I'd probably just leave that one alone, but then focus on line 3.
Yeah, Representative.
Just to answer Carl's
I
curiosity.
think we're gonna wait for, Becky's gonna do some research and get back to us to answer it. That's okay. Thanks. Okay, anything else in the bill? Okay, thank you so much, Becky. We have that one. I just counted one change, but I might have lost one somewhere.
I was just gonna,
Yes.
yeah, the e-board was the one I have.
The e-board and then the debt for debt.
Oh, you are going
If we
to,
can make that change, the debt for debt change, not the bond anticipation change.
oh, so you want to remove this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know you would come to a decision on that one. Okay.
I'm just feeling committee vibe. Is there anyone who would like, so I think we shouldn't just remove that language. I think we need to clarify in one direction or another. And so we could say improvements do include the funding of debt service payments. But we need to go in one direction or another on it. I don't want to just remove the language.
Yes, that would be my recommendation. And in previous versions, it's been that you can do it for a certain time period, like the first 5 years. So I think I've drafted several options over time. So I can just highlight it for now, or
I would love to just someday finish this bill. So I feel comfortable, if every argument I've heard today so far has been that it's something to like get the thing started. And so I would feel comfortable with 2 years does count for 2 years. And we could keep that as a placeholder. We're going to hear from some witnesses. Maybe we'll change our mind after that, but does that work for people as a placeholder?
Sure.
Okay, great. And then removing the TIF emergency. And folks are okay with the yellow, David Hall yellow changes?
I don't know.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
can I remove?
And we're not voting.
Earlier
Yes.
changes, like the auditor.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I remove those
Yes, please.
changes David? Okay,
Thank you, Becky.
thanks.
Brian, you are up and we are happy to hear from you. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. My name is Brian Pine. I serve as the director of the City of Burlington's Community and Economic Development Office. I've been in this position for just under 2 years. Prior to that, I did energy efficiency financing for 5 years with Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. And prior to that, I was with this department for 18 years as the assistant director for housing. Public financing is very much part of my current responsibility and has been for many years. I was instrumental in establishing the city's downtown TIF district in 2011 and had involvement with some projects which were made use of TIF financing for public improvements that enabled us to put affordable housing, a public skate park, the community sailing center, the Eco Science Center, and a number of other critical infrastructure projects to make the waterfront what it is today in Burlington. So we really appreciate the opportunity to share our concerns about S94 with your committee. And as the municipality with Vermont's oldest TIF district, our waterfront TIF district was started in 1996. Coincidentally, the year that I began working for the city of Burlington. So we have some experience. We've learned some lessons. We've had some ups and downs, but I think the experience that we want to share with you can help inform some of the discussions and policy changes that you're currently considering. But because of the status of our 2 TIF districts, we're largely immune or exempt from the impacts of this bill and of the provisions that you're just debating presently. The debt incurrence period for the downtown TIF district has actually already passed, and we have done the borrowing that the voters authorized and that was approved by VEPSI. So we are underway with a massive infrastructure project that will rebuild the entire stretch of Main Street in Burlington from Memorial Auditorium all the way down to the foot of Main Street over the next few years. The project is going out to bid this summer. So there is substantial progress underway already. But the debt incurrence period for the waterfront TIF district is closing so soon that it's almost can be characterized as a TIF emergency, at least for us. So there's not necessarily a TIF emergency, but we're under a really major deadline that we're going to meet. But that project is, of course, the public improvements that will be built connected to the redevelopment of a good chunk of our downtown called City Place, which I think you may have heard about in the news at some point. So we're really sharing today some concerns that we feel obligated really as sort of for our sister cities and towns that use TIF. As you consider changes to what is really the critical economic development tool that municipalities have available, we felt that it was important to share some of these concerns with you and hopefully be able to, the end result being a better piece of legislation, at least we believe. So I would just say that we very strongly support the portion of the bill which extends Hartford and Barry's TIF district extensions, and that you resist making sort of sweeping changes which on their surface may not seem that substantive, but in fact, since they haven't been fully discussed and vetted, at least from our perspective, I think there's a potential here for the law of unintended consequences to be invoked, and hopefully you'll take a cautious approach with the changes that go beyond what was really intended to be primarily the extension of those two TIF districts. So in order to enable municipalities to fully utilize the TIF districts, there's a number of key things to keep in mind. Chief among them is that public infrastructure projects take years to develop from concept to fruition, and all reasonable extensions that are sought and can be justified should be considered by the legislature. And I think you're doing that, of course, for Hartford and Barry now. Burlington sought and received an extension that is allowing us to build the infrastructure to make possible one of the largest redevelopment projects, certainly in Burlington history. In the end, it will be investing over $200 million in our downtown, both the public improvements, but also the private investment. And from that will be some significant benefits that will flow in the future for decades, really. So it's really important to think of them. We like to take a long view on these. Economic development is really the long game, if you will. So we believe the committee, should support the bill as originally passed by the Senate. Unfortunately, some of the amendments that are on the table, we think have the potential to limit the future use of TIF as a tool in both the existing districts, and perhaps will end up discouraging other municipalities from using TIF. TIF really is not the only tool, but it is often the tool in tandem with other funding sources such as grants, equity, tax credits, and debt financing. And as you've all heard many times, making the numbers work on new development in Vermont, as it is elsewhere, but it's very challenging to make that development work. And building the public infrastructure that's so badly needed to make new development possible is very time consuming and involves costs that usually cannot be justified by a developer to incur. And certainly we don't want to pass these costs on to local taxpayers as a local bond for making these infrastructure improvements when they have ultimately are going to bring value to the entire state through growing the grand list, which has massive impact for municipalities to contribute to statewide education funding. So as I said, TIF is really often that critical piece of financing for the public improvements that enables the private development to occur. So I want to specifically talk about the provisions of the bill that concern us, and I want to just go through that real quickly for you. We understand the limitation on the number of districts, 14 active districts in the state at any time, and the list of districts here, as you see, shows that we've got technically 11 districts that are presently active. Of those 11, I think, as was mentioned earlier, Colchester is inactive, but the others are in various states of activation, really. This limitation, while we do understand what it's intended to do, really does constrain the economic engine of what TIF can be for growing Vermont's economy. And it's not clear why the General Assembly would take action to really stifle the use of our single most important economic development tool, and really the only viable means for local government to fund public infrastructure. We used to receive we did just during ARPA, but that's very unusual, large amounts of federal money to subsidize infrastructure projects. But those days are behind us, other than this unusual circumstance of the ARPA period, which is really coming to a close for most all intents and purposes. So we feel that this limitation effectively prevents communities with existing TIF districts that are set to expire in the next coming years from thinking ahead and doing that long range planning to think about setting up a new district that they deem is in their interests and in the interests of their region to foster economic development. So urge you to sort of pause and take caution on the limitation to 14 active districts in the state at any time. The limitation on the number of districts per county, if you look at that list of the current districts, you'll notice that that there are many of them in Chittenden County. And so as soon as you start to limit, this bill essentially takes away the grandfathering provision that's in place now. And so it would essentially mean that there are no districts that will be proposed and can be considered, at least the way we read it, in this county, in Chittenden County. And we urge you to reconsider that approach. The issue you were just discussing earlier, I think, is really a critical issue, that improvements does not include the funding of debt service payments. This is a prohibition against incurring debt to fund the initial debt service payments that is essential. It'll cause serious constraints on smaller municipalities that are really striving to invest in their critical infrastructure to support new housing, new commercial development. And the reason why is because smaller municipalities don't have available fund balances or don't have available cash on hand. And so they need to essentially those borrowings for the purpose of covering debt service. We'll talk a little bit about the bond anticipation note and why that's such an important tool. So municipalities are currently authorized to undertake this type of financing for non-TIF related debt. So there's really no good public policy justification for imposing this restriction on TIF districts. The early years of a TIF district are really difficult, and I mean extremely difficult for a municipality, because you need to incur the debt to make the improvements, but you don't yet have the revenue coming from the private development to cover the debt service. So without this ability, you are clearly putting small municipalities at a serious disadvantage. They really won't be able to overcome what ultimately comes down to a cash flow challenge, a cash flow constraint that'll prevent them from making the investments that are so needed. So the bond anticipation note conversation, I think, was really, it was salient. I think it hit some of the key points. Typically, they are for less than 2 years. They're often for less than a year. And by allowing bond anticipation notes, and I heard you say that I believe you're heading in the direction of sort of striking that change. We would support it, that you preserve the ability of TIF districts, municipalities with TIF districts, to be able to use the bond anticipation note. Again, it's a critical resource for municipalities that don't have the reserves, don't have the cash on hand to cover those upfront public improvement costs that come later. The debt service gets covered by the new tax increment, by the revenue. So that is a really, really important provision. If that's the only thing you change, that would be, I think, really positive. I'm going to opine a little bit on some current practices that these do not signify policy changes, but it's really around the issue of limiting the boundary of a TIF district and its current policy. So I recognize that this is not a change, but really this is an opportunity to kind of open that up a little bit. And the reason why is because as you can imagine, it's impossible to predict what type of development opportunities might emerge in a community that are just outside of a TIF district boundary, right on the edge of it. But there's several examples of new economically challenged sites that become available just outside of a TIF district that could justify adjusting district boundaries. And when a new site that is adjacent to a TIF district becomes available after the district was created, but where there's significant environmental contamination or other infrastructure limitations, TIF is probably the only way you're going to make the public investment, public improvements needed to make that site financially feasible for development purposes. So VEPC should really be given that authority to consider boundary adjustments that are adjacent to existing districts that are consistent with the legislative intent of the statute. I think you can do that. I believe you have the legislative ability to craft something that gives BEPC that ability. Vermont municipalities have very limited tools available to invest in public infrastructure that is really critical to attracting both private and public investment that fosters local community and economic development. While TIF remains the single most important such tool, the changes that are being considered have the potential to impair or hinder the future use of TIF and may discourage additional communities from creating districts that will really help, that can help to drive new economic development for those communities. So I just want to reiterate our support for the Barre and Hartford extensions, but really discourage the committee from taking on new policy changes that haven't really had a chance to be fully vetted and have the potential to put a chilling effect on municipalities' efforts to revitalize their communities. And that's it.
Thank you. Committee, any? Yes.
Just one quick thing. I was interested in your comment about the areas of potential development that exist on the edge of the TIF district. Can you give me an example of that, of where that was used and worked and now there's a thriving something there?
Sure. It does raise a point that I want to just add, and that is there is language in the TIF statute currently allows for municipality to make a case that an adjacent development opportunity that needs a public investment can be covered proportionately, but there's a proportionality requirement. So that's already there, but not allowing for the TIF district boundaries could in fact, if you have a boundary that ends right at the edge of a former commercial building that becomes up for sale, becomes available, and you need to extend infrastructure, whether it be roadway infrastructure, stormwater infrastructure, any type of infrastructure to that property, having the ability to make adjustments, again, that are consistent with the purposes of the statute is a critical resource. So it's there's examples of the factory in Bennington, which is a great example of where if you can extend the boundary of a district, you just have that much more potential to take a non-performing property that is not contributing to the grand list and make investments in public improvements that will grow the grand list today and into the future.
Okay, thanks.
Representative.
Okay, so I thought emergency TIF, who'd ever heard of that? But then were you saying that we're almost in that position? That an example of almost being in that position is the TIF right now for City Place.
Only, let me just clarify though, that we are okay with that. And I shared this with the chair that we're fine with our current downtown TIF, waterfront TIF borrowing is on track to, we're on track to close the financing by the June 30th and move ahead. There's some language in here about substantial change requests, but I think it's narrowed down. So those substantial changes are something we always need to go back to BEPC for, and we don't want to be as a municipality prevented from things change in this world around development pretty frequently and throughout a process. So we want to be able to have that iterative process with BEPC. So as long as you preserve that, we think that municipalities will be well served, and so will the Ed Fund. And I think that's key here. I know that's a key goal.
You're thinking, don't toy with it. Allow the emergency there, not for you, but for others who have changing circumstances. Now, to me, if we're going to have TIFs, I'm sorry, this is speech, but then let's make it easy to comply with the TIFs. Now we're going to go to, we're looking at a study with grants. Do you want the same places that can't do a TIF because it's too hard to compete for the grant money? Or do you want them to be able to do the TIFs and the grant money to be able to go to the other places? And do you want to make the grant money really difficult to get and really encumbered, just difficult? Or do you want to say, good, go with it? If we're going to do the grants, let's make it work more easily. I think if we're going to do a program, let's let it work more easily. Here's testimony to my mind that is saying, this isn't to do with us, but this is to do with everybody else having to do with TIFs. Make it possible to be a successful TIF. And then eventually you're growing the grand list. I feel about it.
Or is everyone responding to Carol, or do people have questions for Brian? Because both are available. I just want to make sure I'm organizing my thoughts well.
I mean,
Yes.
I have
Whatever, yeah,
a different
go for it.
perspective to offer, and that is that you could say in essence that you're asking for the rest of the ed fund taxpayers in the state to underwrite risk that larger municipalities are no longer willing to take. And I don't think that's fair to other people in the state who are paying education taxes. If a town or municipality wants a TIF, they know that there are risks involved. And it should not be the job of the rest of the state to underwrite those risks. We have to look at, it's not just what happens with the ed fund 20 or 30 years from now, it's today too. And we've got to keep the ed fund whole. And I'm concerned about that. At what point do these TIFs begin to erode the ed fund? And then we're asking other taxpayers all around the state to, many of whom could never afford to have a TIF in their district, to underwrite more TIFs for towns that, or municipalities who are big enough, they have a large enough base that they can do a TIF. That make any sense?
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna ask Brian a question and then we can have a conversation. Brian, have you been working with Burlington when you went through a TIF application process?
I did work on the downtown TIF application in 2011, yeah.
Can you realistically imagine a scenario where a community dreams up the idea of a TIF, does all of the pre-planning work for a TIF, goes through VEPC and gets their application approved with VEPC all between June 1st and January 1st of a single year?
That would be extremely rapid process. That would be probably, I think it took us about a year from the time we started till we finished. And we were fortunate enough to have a grant available to hire someone to help us at the time. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I would mention, just because I did hear this question about bond anticipation note. I think there was a little bit of confusion around what it does. You have 5 years, literally 5 years from the date your TIF district is created. If you don't incur debt in the first 5 years, you're done. Your district is done. You can't go and do anything after that. So in that 5-year period, that's when the bond anticipation note becomes so critical. Because even though 5 years sounds like a lot, in the scheme of doing a public improvement project, it can actually, you can run up against that deadline. So that's a critical period, gives you a chance to activate the district. It avoids meeting the deadline and having your district essentially shut down on you.
Okay, thank you. I think our legislative council might have a different reading of statute on that, so we can have her, we can dive deeper on that separately. Any other questions or thoughts for Brian? Yes, go for it.
Brian, you've been, I hope I'm looking at you, looking at the fisheye thing here.
I see you, so yeah.
And actually, Brian, can you do me a favor and stop touching your desk?
Is
Do you
it
mind? Your face is moving a lot. And so if Jim's looking at you, I'm looking at you. Okay, thank you. Go for it, Jim. Sorry.
Brian, you've been very articulate about explaining your points, and your logic is clear and convincing so far as it goes. But as Representative Demrow said, we're stuck with a situation because we have this crazy, I'll call it crazy, ed financing system we have, and the TIFs are paid for in large part by other taxpayers who in many cases can't possibly achieve the threshold of establishing the TIF and therefore building the infrastructure that would be necessary for them to build out within village centers or other places where we collectively say we want to build instead of up on the hills and in the woods or something like that. So I agree with Representative Odie to the point of saying, and Scott, let's not make it more complicated what we say that you can already do. But there needs to be a limit, if I could be somewhat blunt, as to how far we let this go of having all your municipality and schools where they're struggling to pay for their property taxes. There's a limit how far we can go to see the ed fund chewed up, shall we say, with TIFs here and there. So I'm not helping you, Brian, but that's my point of view.
Yeah. And I'm just gonna, if I could respond to a couple things here. Obviously, we would need more time to get into the entire concept that TIF is taking funds, taking from the ed fund. I think we present a lot of data showing that actually is not the fact. When you see that the original taxable value continues to flow to the ed fund as if nothing had happened, and 25% of the increment, 25% of the new growth that would not have been possible without the public improvements also flows to the ed fund. I think the math will be quite clear, but I won't bore you with those details right now. But I just want to say there's no clear evidence that investing in the infrastructure, but for that investment, the growth in the ed fund and the grand list would not be there. So I think that's the piece that you may disagree with, but I can show you some data about St. Albans is a great example. What happened in St. Albans as a result of TIF is a case study in how this can work to both rebuild and revitalize downtowns, but also add to the statewide ed fund. And you're right, our district first was created in 1996. The Act 60 had not come about. So the initial concept predated the statewide education tax. That is true. Yeah.
Representative Beck.
Yeah, I'd like to echo, I'm not concerned one bit with the ed fund. I mean, 30% of something is way better than 100% of nothing. And 100% of nothing was what happens if you don't develop. 30% of the growth is that the only people I'm worried about in this whole conversation, and it's a local decision, and they can come to it with their taxpayers and the people that they borrow from, is whether the growth is going to be enough to provide the resources to pay the bond. And I look at that as a local decision. They take the risk locally. Hopefully it's an informed one, but I'm not worried about the ed fund at all.
I think I'm going to, do people have direct questions for Brian? Because otherwise I'm going to say no to him. And I want to know, Saoirse, did our second witness arrive? Okay, so I think he's not going to join us today. Okay, great. Anything else for Brian? Yes.
I would very much like you to send us that information on St. Albans as soon as you can. That would answer some of my questions if in fact it says what you said it said.
Sorry to shake the table, but I had to jot down a note there.
Okay.
I didn't know the screen was shaking. I knew it as I was doing it. So.
It's cool. Thank you.
The shaking doesn't bother me either, but anyway.
I know your committee has other work to do. I will come back anytime you'd like. And our consultant, David G. White, is not only a friend of 30 years, but he is really a wealth of knowledge on all the implications of TIF statewide. He's worked on most of the districts. So if you ever have an opportunity to delve deeper, we would be there as soon as you request it.
Thank you. He was our next witness after you, but he's not able to make it today. So we will have to find our way through that. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Representative Meadows.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up Scott here and say that just looking at Patrick Titterton's presentation that he did earlier this year, TIF districts is about a $5.9 million expenditure to the state, and that was FY21. So it's not a large amount of money in a $2.2 billion fund.
Right, and that's what isn't collected, but what it doesn't say is, I mean, if you'd done nothing, you wouldn't have had anything collected.
Right.
Could we have those numbers? I'd love to see those.
I think there are a lot of questions about the idea that if you do nothing, that if you didn't do nothing would have happened. happened. I think that's like a substantially like sort of, you know, economic development, spiritual debate more than I think at some point it moves out of it's like just becomes a difference of opinion about which economists to listen to on that one. Representative Sims, and then there was someone over here, but I don't know who it was. Sorry.
Yeah, and again, I mean, I think
Can we turn off our little?
my biggest challenge is the way that the program is currently structured is difficult. I think I know plenty of other communities that would love to withhold paying into the ed funds to be able to make investments in their community. And I'm sure those investments would generate additional revenue for everyone, but we don't have a mechanism that works at the right size and scale for all communities. And from where I'm sitting, all communities have significant needs around water and sewer and other infrastructure to help support economic development. And they'd love to hold back funds from the ed fund and, you know, but that tool isn't accessible to all communities right now. And hopefully that's what our study can help come back with some suggestions so that we can help all communities address the significant infrastructure needs and make the best use of our IIJA money and make sure that all communities can access that.
I think the language in the bill is sort of points out a number of places where there's been confusion in the statute over a number of years. And in some places clarifies that language towards making TIFs a little bit easier, and some ways clarifies the language towards making TIFs a little bit tighter. And I think that strikes a good compromise around an issue that I think is always going to divide this body, not necessarily even on political lines, but just on, you know, however we come down on TIFs. Other thoughts here? Yeah.
I don't know how global you want to bring it. I was, as you maybe can recall, starting at the beginning of the year, I really thought revenue sharing was the way to go and get rid of some of these contrivances. And then the question is, how do you fund it? And more recently, we had a conversation about expanding the base, lowering the rate, and frankly, generating some funds in excess of what we now and put the excess into a revenue sharing formula and get rid of some of these because they're divisive, as this debate illustrates.
Anyone else? Okay. There are pieces of this bill that many people want to move forward fairly soon. And there are pieces of this bill that obviously we could sit on for a while, but it's all one bill, so we can't do that. And so Becky's making a few changes. Are there other witnesses that folks want to hear from on this?
Just in a sentence, I can live with the bill the way it is, but we have an elephant in the room that we should talk about at some point.
Okay, the Senate being the elephant?
No,
Oh, okay.
trying to figure out how to build infrastructure in small communities that desperately need it.
Well, and that's why we
That's
have
in the bill.
that super awesome new study, which I'm sure is going to make it just right across the finish line, that study.
Hopefully, yeah.
Okay, yes.
So, you probably picked up that I'm not a strong believer in TIFs, and I would really like to see some data that shows their work. And I'm scared to death about what's happening to the ed fund.
Mhm.
So who was that guy that he mentioned at the very end?
It was David White, who's the president of a real estate investment advisor who was invited to join us today and wasn't able to make it. And he is interestingly sort of is hired as a consultant by, I believe, I might be misspeaking, by many of the TIFs that form in the state, hire White and Burke to do thousands of dollars of sort of startup work for them.
And Barry did.
And so
Hired
he's
him too.
coming, he was sort of invited to come in and talk about it. I think if you want neutral numbers, talking to JFO might be better, though he has a lot, I mean, he's a great deal of expertise on setting these up. And I also imagine, since you just said that out loud, you wanted that number, that many of the people sitting on the sidelines are about to send you many emails about it, Representative.
Well, that would be fine, and perhaps having JFO in then.
Okay, one more time. Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Good, thanks.
Just to round out the picture on Burke and White, I would also say that they help a number of communities around municipal planning grants and
Yes.
other sort of design and planning initiatives. So, you know, I think they probably have a broad view of the variety of communities and their needs and can maybe help
Let me just say Burke and White, I have heard.
Oh, okay, great, okay.
Or White and Burke, whatever they are. Yeah,
And this is the White of the White and Burke
okay.
that was invited to come in and is a statewide TIF expert. Not done with.
It would be great if we could have JFO in.
One more time?
Just-
Okay.
Yeah, because I mean, I know what Representative Manos and Representative Beck said. I thought that I did my own math on this and came up with about 20 million expenditures in the fund. 20 million.
But for, it's all how you interpret.
On revenue, but I may be wrong about that and I'm willing to be convinced otherwise, but I think it would be great to have JFO.
We will have JFO back in, and I do agree that it is and all on how you interpret the but for. Any other witnesses? Anyone? Okay, Representative.
I just was going to say, part of the art of calculating the what if or but for in TIF is what's the indigenous growth that JFO uses in the absence of, and that's a guesstimate of art.
Within the district and outside the district.
Exactly, and then from that is derived the increment, and that's obviously malleable.
And I do think there are some questions about if you're using just the statewide growth as sort of a stand-in for what the but-for growth would have been in that community, in a community that's already primed for redevelopment, or they wouldn't be thinking of doing a TIF in the first place. There's like a little bit, it's not really a solvable problem. I think there's.
No, it's squishy for sure.
There, yes. Okay,
It's a but for.
with that,
For Betsy.
thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow morning at 9. We are going to go deep on childcare for the whole morning tomorrow.
Oh, great.